Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of the Daily Medieval Podcast. And today I'm joined by an incredible historian, one who has written about a topic which is very close to my heart because it is about a family here in Norfolk where I am based. So, without further ado, please can I welcome the author of God's Own Gentlewoman, The Life of Margaret Paston, Diane Watt. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
No, it's superb, and I'm very interested to get into the history of the Paston family. But before doing that, I'd love to know where did your pursuit for history begin? What inspired you to follow your career and get to where you are today?
I think it really started when I was a child. So I was brought up in the west of Scotland, and when I was a young child, I lived in Irvine, which is in Ayrshire, and it's a very historic town. It's got a castle, Seagate Castle, where Mary Queen of Scots has reputedly stayed, and there were witchcraft, there were the burning of witches there, execution of witches, execution of Covenanters who were basically dissenting Protestants. And my grandmother lived in a old cottage, which was once part of the Eglinton estate, which was a big country house. And I even have on my desk a cannonball, which my gran found probably in her garden. So that had this sort of interest right from my earliest years, really, in everything historical.
Mm. No, that's really interesting. And so then, how did you go then from that kind of Scottish upbringing to then somewhere quite far away, going from the top of the country to the bottom, to then the Paston family in Norfolk?
So it was quite a journey, really. I studied English literature with history and archaeology as an undergraduate in Glasgow. And that's where I really developed my interest in medieval history and literature. Then I went on to do an MA in medieval studies at the University of Bristol. And it was there that I first really came across the Paston family when I was studying at Bristol. And from there, I've sort of, that's about 3 decades ago, about 30 years ago. But my interest has really developed out of those sort of initial studies.
Mm. No, wow. So what is it about? Because obviously, we've got various different types of histories, economics and political kings, whatever it may be. What is it then about kind of, I guess, looking at a family and in this case a specific character that then you find that kind of drew you in?
Okay, so when I was an undergraduate studying history and literature, I was really struck by what was then a big absence of women's perspectives.
Mm.
And so I started to look into that because there was nothing on the curriculum at all at that point in the 1980s. And I found out that, in fact, women had been writing books and letters in the Middle Ages. So that really piqued my interest. And then, so when I came across the Paston letters, then I was really excited, partly because these were letters of people who were wealthy and privileged, yes, but they weren't religious. They weren't monks. They weren't nuns. Or some of the modest members of the family did become nuns, but um, this is a kind of everyday life of yes, privileged and wealthy people, but nevertheless people who were living secular lives, living lives out there in the world, and here we had a whole range of letters by women. So I was really excited to find that.
Mm. No, that's yeah, no, that is fascinating. And so let's then go and jump into your book and place then the Paston family in the history that's going on surrounding them. So what is the kind of period that the book is focusing on, and yeah, what is happening at this point?
Okay, so Margaret Paston was living during the years of leading up to and the years of the Wars of the Roses, and this was a series of civil wars between the houses of Lancaster and House of York. It was called the Wars of the Roses because it was named after the White Rose of York and the Red Rose of Lancaster, and so this was a period of a lot of civil disruption. It wasn't simply at the highest level. everybody was involved in this really, and there were skirmishes as well in the localities. There was a sort of broader sort of political and social chaos that Margaret was kind of caught up in. And the Pastons themselves, like, they shifted allegiance in the course of the Wars and the Roses. So they started off supporting the Lancastrians, they shifted the Yorkists, and then they shifted back again. And Margaret's sons were involved in some of the battles. So this is very much then a sort of period of chaos when Margaret's living in for a large part of her life.
Mm. Now, interestingly, there it's why was it then? Why was it that the family then flipped back and forth a few times? And does Margaret comment on that at all?
So she doesn't really comment on the sort of the politics of the time, in the sense of the larger politics,
Mm.
beyond reporting on news and events. So she's not really reflecting on the sort of politics. But I think many people in this period did shift sides. But
Right.
we've also got to remember that the Pastons were really they were kind of nouveau riche. So, there was only really Margaret Paston's father-in-law that had sort of accumulated the sort of family's wealth and properties. So they were very, very how should I put this? They looked for opportunities as a
Right.
family. They looked for opportunities to establish themselves. And so I guess that they monitored the way that the political wind was blowing and responded accordingly.
Mm. Yeah, no, that's interesting that because I guess that I don't know. You imagine, I guess maybe through popular media and stuff that they're thinking of like the likes of Game of Thrones and stuff, where you've got these oaths that people take for allegiances. But yeah, there must have been a fair number of people who were, as you say, that opportunistic. Um,
There's there's a fair number of people who find themselves having to be pardoned, including the Paston sons for their activities previously. So yeah, I think there's a lot of people who are opportunistic at this time.
yes.
Yeah.
Oh, right. So, um, let's look at Margaret then. So, can you kind of give us a brief history of Margaret's life then, and why she, why did you write about her? Why is she important to history, and especially looking at this history through a female perspective?
So in a sense, I think Margaret's important precisely. Her importance lies in the fact that she isn't important in terms of history,
Okay.
at least in terms of the conventional sense. So, if her letters hadn't survived, and there's a large element of chance in the survival of these letters, then we wouldn't have known very much about her at all.
Mm.
She would have been, she wouldn't have been completely invisible in the historical record, but she would certainly not have, we wouldn't have had this incredible wealth of information about her life. Um, and she herself, she was born around about 1420. She married when she was about 20 years old, which is when her letters start to be kept. She herself came from a wealthy family. She'd inherited her father's estates when he died. He died when she was a child. So she made a really good match for this upward mobile Paston family. Um, and what I think is really remarkable about her is, so she had 7 surviving children. She may have had more who didn't survive into adulthood. So she's obviously involved very much in the looking after the family. And but she was also involved in managing the family's estate, because her husband, who was a lawyer,
Mm.
spent a lot of time in London and elsewhere. I mean, that's why there's so many letters there, because this was the means by which they communicated. So she was really running these, extensive properties. She was running manorial courts. She was even having to defend these properties when they were being attacked by Paston enemies, because, as I say, there's this chaos of the Civil War really kind of filtered across society. People saw not only the opportunity to change sides, but also the opportunity to maybe grab some wealth from elsewhere. There wasn't the same, the legal systems weren't necessarily operating as effectively as they might otherwise be. And so she found herself having to defend Paston properties from attack. And she even at one point describes herself as a captainess, a sort of female captain, a woman captain, leading the defense of the properties. So although she wasn't a political player on a large scale, she nevertheless was very much somebody who had quite a lot of power and influence within her own immediate circle.
That's really interesting, especially when you say about that, that the captainess kind of thing. It reminds me of how contemporaries to Adela of Blois would call her a lord and give her this kind of male name. I mean, in terms of her contemporaries, and also just in her writings of herself, is this kind of traversing gender that we pop up in the Middle Ages at times, especially within women's history?
I mean, I certainly think that her use of captainess is interesting. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, that's her letter was the first time that word appears. So she, seems to have coined the word, or else, it was an early use of that word. But think of the larger context. Joan of Arc had been alive when Margaret was younger. She there's no, she wouldn't have been a supporter of Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc was very much regarded very negatively in England in this period, and you're often seen as a sort of as a witch because of her activities. But there was also other examples at the time of women who were kind of involved in warfare. I mean, the obvious one would be Margaret of Anjou, who was leading her the armies in the Wars of the Roses, sort of in the place of her husband. She didn't necessarily get involved in active battle. She tended to retire. But she would lead the troops to battle. So we do have a sort of sense of women taking on these sort of martial roles, but I'm not sure. But that, and so I suppose in a sense, there's possibly a transgressive element to it. But I think there's also a sense that women could be seen as leaders, especially if there was not a sort of if there wasn't a suitable sort of man to lead armies at that time. So think of Elizabeth I. This it's transgressive up to a point, but only, I'd say, up to a point.
Right, I get you. That's it's what's really interesting then. Following on from that is then looking at her letters. It kind of obviously there's then it begs the question to a certain level of literacy and education. What was her education like, and was what language was she writing in? And from looking at her penmanship, was she? Do we get an idea of what kind of intellect she was?
Okay, so I think we've got to one point we've got to sort of make right at the beginning of this is that Margaret probably couldn't write herself.
Right.
No evidence to suggest that she was able to write. She may have been able to read. She may have even been able to read some Latin, but she relied on scribes to write for her. So generally speaking, it was her husband or her sons, or sort of trusted supporters and servants who would write her letters. So she was dictating her letters effectively. But that wasn't unusual for the time. Writing was very much seen as a manual activity, something that scribes did. So even very exalted figures who could write would often turn to scribes to write the letters for them, in the same way as one might use a secretary today. But nevertheless, I think we're fairly confident that she wasn't actually able to write. But that wasn't that unusual. But it doesn't mean that she didn't have an education. She certainly didn't have the sort of formal education her husband had, for example. So he studied in Cambridge, before he became a lawyer, or studied to become a lawyer. So we know that that sort of opportunity wasn't available to her. We don't know, because we don't know much about Margaret's life before she got married. That's when she first really enters the record. We can only sort of extrapolate from the period really to get a sense of what sort of education she might have had. So she could have had an education in a convent. Girls were sometimes had tutors, but very much their mothers would play an important role in their education. And as they became young women, they would often be sent to be in service to another household of a similar or higher social status, so that they would learn about running a household.
Right.
And certainly we know that one of Margaret's daughters was put into service in this way with some family friends. And in fact, she seems to have been expelled, as it were. So there's a bit of an interesting story there. But so it's just likely that Margaret would have had a similar sort of upbringing.
Mm. Okay. So then of these letters, how many were there, and what, is there any particular themes or topics that they focus on that you were able to form this history from?
So there's about 100 letters, and documents, slightly over 100 letters and documents by Margaret. And then there's obviously also letters to Margaret as well, other letters by family members that discuss issues that are relevant to her, discuss her directly. So there's a real kind of wealth of material there. And I suppose in terms of the themes, we get a sense of the whole arc of Margaret's life, really, from her marriage through to the years leading up to her death. And we see Margaret's life changing and the preoccupations changing. So the early letters, there's a wonderful early letter where she discusses her pregnancy, and she, it was rather cryptic in its references to pregnancy, but she's certainly excited by her pregnancy. There are very loving letters to her husband during his absences, from the earliest marriage, really, right up to the end of his life. So even though it was an arranged marriage, and we often think of arranged marriages as being not marriages of love, but this was this was a couple who was very devoted to one another. But she also writes very practical letters. So when, for example, the family estate of Gresham is being attacked by their enemies, she writes her husband this amazing letter where she asks him to obtain for her some crossbows and windlasses, which are kind of winding mechanisms for the crossbows. And she asks for this alongside asking him to buy her some sugar and almonds. So there's a real sense of the domestic and the martial almost kind of merging in that letter. But she doesn't really she doesn't talk about her feelings a lot. I mean, we do get a strong sense of her love for her husband. But for example, when she's forced out of Gresham and the manorial house is destroyed, she doesn't say anything about her feelings. She just really describes what happens in quite sort of in a quite sort of detached way, even though she must have been extremely traumatized by the whole experience. And then as she gets older, major preoccupations become her children, finding suitable marriages for children, just trying to steer her children away from unsuitable relationships. And there's some very sort of moving letters actually concerning her son Walter, who's very much her favourite son. He went to Oxford to study at university. She was really interested in his studies. She had opinions about what he should go on and do with his degree and in his future career. But sadly, he died as a student when he was a student, possibly for. So there's this kind of sense of this great loss for Margaret in that letter. So there's a kind of whole range of themes, really, from the more military to the familial, to the very domestic.
Oh wow, that's such an insight into so many different aspects of history. And so how did then these letters survive today, and especially so many of them as well?
Well, there's a sort of element of sort of chance about that. So it's not entirely down to chance. I mean, it's pretty clear that Margaret herself valued these letters. So she advised one of her sons to, this is after the death of her husband, she advised him to make sure he kept all his letters and papers in order, because as his father would have done, because they would be so important. And one of the reasons these letters and papers would be so important is that often they discuss property matters, and they could be used as evidence, for example, in disputes over the ownership of property, and in other disputes as well, any sort of other legal matters. So there was a kind of legal dimension to these letters, that meant that the family, because of the sort of chaos of the time, and because of I suppose the sort of the family's own trajectory as accumulating properties very rapidly, it became really important to them to keep their paperwork and keep that paperwork in order. But even though that's the case, and these papers were kept and stored by the family members themselves, they could easily have been lost, because what happened was, in the 18th century, the Paston family had sort of risen in social status and had gained aristocratic status, but they also lost all the money. And so by the 18th century, Oxnead Hall, which had become their main the main sort of family seat, as it were, had sort of started to fall into decay. And a local historian went to visit the hall and found in the records room all these letters, and basically bought a lot of them. And it's really down to that, to him and to other antiquarians, that these letters have survived, because eventually they passed from these antiquarians into eventually the British Library bought them, you're moving forward some centuries. But really, I think if it hadn't been for the intervention of these 18th century antiquarians and local historians, we just simply wouldn't have letters.
Oh wow, that's incredible. That is. And so, all of them now in the British Library, or is there still some in private ownership?
So there were some that had also seemed to have been passed down through the family, but they were also purchased by the British Library. So virtually everything's in the British Library now. The one or two records elsewhere, a few papers in other archives, but it's the British Library has the substantial collection.
Okay, wow. And so then, going from those, as you say, over 100 letters and documents, how did you then go from the letter to then the book? And how did you know which ones to use, how to use these letters to then fill this story?
So I think one of the reasons why perhaps Margaret Paston isn't more well known outside of Norfolk is that there are all these letters, but they can be quite difficult to read. Some of them are very long. Sometimes she wrote more than one, and several in one day. I mean, she must be sitting dictating these letters for hours on end. It's quite incomprehensible. They often allude to people or to events that it's quite difficult even for us as scholars to work out what's going on in the letters. You sometimes are able to put together both sides of the correspondence, but if the correspondence is, especially if the correspondence is between family members, or because some of the letters are kept in, we have drafts of some letters, we can put together the different sides of the correspondence. But even still, it's very disjointed. It doesn't make a coherent narrative. So that was a big challenge that I was facing, is how do you write Margaret's life using these letters as a source without overwhelming your readership with a lot of information, in some almost incidental information. So I felt like I had to be really selective. So from over 100 odd letters, I selected around 20 letters and some other documents, and made each chapter focus on a particular letter. And I extrapolated from that letter to write in a sense like a micro history of what's going on in Margaret's life at that time. So whereas many of the letters are written, for example, in the 1460s, which was a particularly sort of chaotic time in the Paston family history, I still tried to sort of choose letters that represented different periods of Margaret's life.
Mm.
So a lot of it was kind of you're thinning it down in a sense to make it a narrative a clear narrative that covered the sort of they gave a taste of what Margaret's life was about, covered some of the main events, but didn't get too didn't get the narrative didn't become too disruptive,
Right.
or too overwhelmed with detail. So yes, so I took the letters as a starting point, and then yeah, as I say, tried to talk about Margaret's life at that point and when the letter's written, but also construct some of the context for the letters, for understanding the letters,
Mm.
so that the letters kind of really make sense to a reader who's not necessarily specialist in this period.
Mm. And so, with those letters, did you find, were there any particular challenges in a sense that, was there perhaps some years where there were gaps or particular events that she didn't necessarily comment on? Um, did any of that occur?
Yeah, so absolutely. So there were other gaps, and sometimes these gaps seem quite significant. I mean, the an obvious gap is a period of some months after the sudden death of her husband.
Right.
So we know about the funeral that was organized for her husband because we have a lot of detail about that from other letters within the family. But we don't know how that affected Margaret. There's radio silence for that period. But I think it's important to to think about the possible significance of that. It may be that Margaret was just so shocked and upset by the death of her husband that she just didn't actually feel able um to pick up the pen, or metaphorically, or even to be sort of fully involved in the family life for a while. It may have been that she withdrew for a period. Similarly, towards the end of her life, her letters tail off as her health is starting to decline.
Mm.
There it's possible to get perhaps a sense of what's going on in her life by looking at her last will and testament, because in the Middle Ages, wealthy women and men of this social class, write long and detailed wills, and this would often give you an indication of what's going on in their relationships. Who are the important people? The people that are important to them, for example. So yes, there's certainly gaps there, but there are also ways of, I think, filling those gaps, or ways of interpreting those gaps.
Right. Oh, brilliant. And so, what did you find personally most rewarding about writing this book and shedding that light then on Margaret Paston?
Well, I absolutely loved writing the book. In many ways, it was a pleasure from beginning to end. Um, but one aspect of it that I found of my research for this I found really interesting was that I made a decision to visit the various sites mentioned by Margaret, places where the family had residences, um, places that she visited, in particular, sort of churches, pilgrimage sites. Um, Norwich itself. Spent quite a lot of time walking around Norwich. And I wanted to get just a sense of those places. And I felt that really by visiting them, it really helped me understand better Margaret's experiences, in some quite sort of ineffable ways. But one of the things that I decided to do was to include in this book accounts then of my visits to these various places, my impressions of them, um, and and also, just some quite sort of incidental things that occurred, conversations with local people.
Mm.
Because Margaret is such an important figure within Norfolk. Norfolk knows about Margaret. And so people were really happy to chat about her, which is just quite astonishing so many centuries later. Um, so that sort of aspect of it I found particularly rewarding.
Yeah, no, definitely. And what a fantastic way to kind of bring that history alive as well. And so then what's interesting, I guess, about that and what you say is that, coming from an academic background, this kind of the way that you've written it is I would say almost very different. how did you find that process of writing for a wider audience and doing a sort of a different style that wasn't very kind of academic in that sense?
So yeah, I mean, and I really didn't want to be writing this as an academic book. That was something I really didn't want to do. And one of the things that we're trained to do when we write academic books is the importance of objectivity.
Mm,
And I very consciously tried to move away from that. So I very consciously um, talked about myself within the book. Some of the reasons why I was drawn to Margaret's letters, for example, as well as my various visits around Norfolk, my various travels around Norfolk, and bringing these kind of personal elements in really helps, I think, shift the tone away from that academic narrative. And there was a question about like how much scholarship should I include? When you encounter academic books, as you know, there's a lot of footnotes, a big bibliographies. Now I do have some footnotes and a short bibliography in this book, but I didn't want to have the sort of all that heavy scholarly apparatus that can be really off-putting to a reader. I wanted this to read, not to read to be read in that way. So one of the challenges was to get the balance right, to be able to convey enough information, enough scholarship, enough scholarly context to my readership, without overburdening them. And I'm hopeful that I've managed to achieve that balance. But it's that was a big challenge for me. It's just how much
mm,
scholarship in a sense to bring in.
yeah. No, it sounds brilliant, and sounds like an incredible book that I'm sure people enjoy. And what do you hope that then readers will take from this, from your book?
So primarily, one of my aims is that Margaret finally gets the attention she
Yeah.
deserves. As I said, she's such a well-known figure in Norfolk. She's really something of a local hero, but not widely known beyond Norfolk or beyond the kind of confines of academia. So I really want to get Margaret's history out there, and more broadly to get women's history out there, so that we get that sort of a perspective. There are lots of books about the aristocracy and the royalty in the Tudor period in particular. So this is giving us a perspective from just a different social class, still
Mm.
a privileged social class, but not from that very highest ranks. And I really thought that's an important history to convey to people.
Mm. No, 100%, especially with those letters that give such an insight. And yeah, a huge congratulations on the book, and I
Thank
do
you.
hope it goes really well. Lastly, then, what advice would you give to aspiring writers or historians who want to explore rather than wider topics such as the Crusades or whatever it may be, or Tudor history, to
Mm.
look at rather families and historical figures?
So I think obviously do your research, but part of that research is going beyond the sort of primary sources or even the existing historical narratives, but to start to think about the practicalities of people's lives. Think about the clothes that they wore. Think about the transport they used. Think about the food that they ate. Think about how they spent their leisure time. And if you don't know something, then look it up. Allow yourself to go down rabbit holes, and of course, visit the places where they lived and died.
Apologies. No, fantastic, and it's so true. And I've been able to speak to many historians who have written characters and figures, and likewise they echo your words. And so, thank you ever so much for coming on, and it's been an absolutely brilliant discussion about Margaret Paston, and like I say, best of luck with the book and everything.
Thank you very much. Thanks,
Wonderful.
Luke.
And thank you everyone for watching. There'll be more episodes each month as we talk to more historians, archaeologists, and authors. So please check out the ones that have already come out and await the ones that are coming. Thank you very much. And there we go.